Howdy, my name is Israel. I am the team lead of NASA Suits.
I'm Tommy Thomas. I'm the UI team lead.
My name is Celeste. I'm a junior aerospace engineering major, and I'm on the UI team, and I'm also the social media lead.
What's your current position here at Texas A&M?
I've been at A&M for about 6 years now as a professor of practice, aerospace engineering. I have a lab there called the Astro Lab, and we do a lot of work in, well, as it sounds.
What kind made you go to A&M? You weren't an A&M student, were you?
No, I wasn't actually. So I was teaching at a university in Australia for a few years after I finished school, and when I came to NASA as a first time being an employee at NASA, I sort of continued doing projects with students, and immediately started looking for sort of colleagues in local universities that could have graduate students that could work on projects with NASA. So turned out the aerospace engineering at A&M had a lot of connections and interest in working on space projects, and I ended up doing a lot of co-supervision of students at A&M while I was at NASA, and even after I became an astronaut, I was still working with students that were at A&M, and once in a while I would come up to A&M and meet with students, and sometimes fly back and forth, and we had students from there come and spend summers at NASA and work there. And so we had an ongoing connection with A&M faculty and students for quite a few years. And eventually, after my space flights, they asked me if I would come on faculty when I was done. And I decided I liked it very much at A&M and decided to join the faculty.
So we just wanted to know more about your position at NASA, especially while you were an astronaut there, what exactly you were doing, like on the missions.
Yeah, well, see, when I started there, I was a flight controller, guidance and control for the space station, and it's called the Attitude Determination and Control Officer, and that was for a few years. But I had already applied to the astronaut program. In fact, it was kind of strange because I showed up there for work during my first week, and it just so happened to be the same week that I got interviewed. The astronaut cycle was going on, and the first week of interviews was happening. So I showed up for work as a flight controller, and first thing I had to tell them was, next week I'm interviewing for the astronaut job, and so I had to be off that next week to do that. And eventually I got that job a few years later, not that cycle, but the next cycle. And then when I was in the astronaut office, I was a representative working back for guidance and control. So it was kind of my specialty. So I, kind of was a liaison between the astronaut office and engineering and operations for guidance and control. And you have a lot of ground jobs before you actually fly. So I did many things like, worked as a Capcom, and I worked as a support person for other missions in different ways. Once I got assigned to a mission, though, you're in training for a very long time. So, I spent a lot of that time traveling, to different countries for training. So we had the Columbia accident happened during my training, and so and at the time I was actually crew support for the crew that was on orbit on the space station. So in any case, there was a lot of time spent in Russia, a lot of time spent in other countries, Canada, Europe, Japan, training, and so it ended up being kind of a 10-year period. Probably 8 of those where I spent half the time in Russia during doing training. And between flights, and when you're not flying, you're doing some kind of support job where you're representing the astronaut office to the rest of the space community, to help make decisions, that make sense, for the crew. Basically, it's providing crew oversight on decisions that may affect the crew. And so that's what most of the jobs in some way or another, end up being. But during my flights themselves, I had a long duration flight on the space station, 2008. It was 6 months with 2 Russians for most of the time, and then the second to last flight of the space shuttle program was the next mission I did, and that was STS-134 was called, and we finished the assembly of the space station on that mission. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm surprised at the way other people answer that question. For me, it was always what I wanted to do. Since I was 6 years old, I've wanted to do this. I happened to be in Florida, and I saw the launch of the Apollo 11 mission when I was a kid, and I remember telling my parents on that day that that's what I wanted to do, and I just never went back on that dream. And I know many other people, kind of just threw in their application and were just incredibly well qualified and got selected. But for most people, it's a lifelong dream come true.
How was the launch of Apollo 11? Could you describe that experience?
Vaguely, because I was really, I was only 6, but I know that I was in Daytona Beach, and there was some kind of park, and I remember I was climbing on a jungle gym at the time. So, all I remember is seeing it from climbing on the jungle gym, and then saying something to my dad, and it's very quite an overwhelming thing to see. If you haven't seen a launch in person, it's something you got to do. It's incredible to see there's a couple things that are really amazing about it that just can't be captured in video, or if you see it on TV. You get this feeling of just the amount of technology and everything that humanity is capable of coming together into making this one event possible and happening right in front of you. It's very impressive. It's inspirational.
What's your academic background? Speaking of, how did you go from a 6-year-old to an astronaut? What was that phase like?
Yeah. Well, it's a long story, and I don't think I want to torture you too much, but essentially, I didn't know what to do for most of that time. I just, through high school, every time I had a project of some kind or a writing assignment, I always wrote about space or did my projects about space or something. But I showed up at Cal Poly, California State Polytechnic Institute, in California, as a freshman, and the first shuttle flight was January of that year. So while I was a freshman in the dorms, at university, the first shuttle flight went up, and I just thought, now's my chance to try to figure out what to do and do it right. And so I called NASA the next day after that. This was January 9th, 81. And called NASA the next day, and surprisingly enough, it's not very hard to reach the astronaut selection office. There's an astronaut selection office. You call and they'll answer the phone and talk to you, and they'll give you advice. You can call them today and they'll do the same thing. They basically said, you can't plan on this. You can't organize your whole life around doing this, but whatever you do choose to do, do it to the best of your ability, and do things that you're passionate about. And so that was pretty good advice, and that kind of helped me, I think, set the stage for my undergraduate years to really take everything quite seriously. And then what happened was my graduation from university, by chance, the graduation speaker was an astronaut, and one who went to that, to my school. I went to Cal Poly. It was Hoot Gibson, and I'd never met an astronaut before, and I got a chance to meet him during the graduation, and so that was really, a turning point for me too, because I sort of felt like I had been following the footsteps of someone who made it, and so all of a sudden it seemed like the possibility was real, and then I went to Caltech for a master's and MIT for PhD work, and kept started applying to the program as soon as I was eligible.
From bachelor's to finishing your PhD, how many years was that?
I don't think I want to tell you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, good point.
It was too many. No, it was 7 years.
Oh, wow.
For the master's and the PhD, it took me 7 years, I was enjoying it. I really enjoyed MIT. I mean, I took a lot more courses than if you look at what's required. I took about a third more, well, half more. So like a third of the courses I took were over and above what was required. It was an opportunity to just have amazing people teach you what they're experts at, and I did my main focus was guidance and control, but I did a minor in planetary science, and I I loved being there. So maybe I wasn't in enough of a hurry, but it was a long time.
Kind of building off of that, you mentioned earlier that you taught in Australia before you became an astronaut here in America. I was just wondering how you made that transition from going to MIT for graduate school to teaching in Australia.
Yeah, what happened was, as soon as I graduated from MIT, I've been wanting to take a round the world trip. I hadn't traveled very much prior to that, other than Canada and Mexico, and so that was my present to myself, was just to take a round the world trip. Actually, I wanted to scuba dive in a whole bunch of places around the world, and I actually borrowed a lot of money, and my parents gave me some money, and I went for 3 months, and I just traveled all around, and most of it was diving. But at the same time, I was engaged, and we were thinking about living somewhere else for a few years. And my wife is she's a doctor, and she wanted to do something that was third world medicine like, and I was looking for something that where she could do something like that, and I could do something in aerospace for a period of time. And it turned out I went through Sydney, Australia, and visited the aerospace engineering department there, University of Sydney, and I really liked meeting the people there. And I didn't know, didn't make any plans, but I came back back home and found a letter from them inviting me to come down there for a 2-year appointment. And the thing about Australia, it's not a third world country, right? But they have the outback, and outback medicine, Aboriginal medicine is a very interesting area there. So my wife spent time in the outback, flying around in small planes, helping people in small villages. And I was teaching at the University of Sydney. So it turned out to be a really good experience for both of us.
You mentioned that you were on the International Space Station. Do you miss anything about being up there?
Oh yeah, I'd go back in a second. I really enjoyed being up there. It's a long time. 6 months is a very long time. And people kept asking me, are you how are you feeling? How are you holding out? And I was loving it. I loved every minute. There's sort of a typical point about 2/3 into it where you're working every day, all day long. You wake up, you come out of your sleep station, and you're there at work, and you're at it, racing the clock all day with a full schedule of tasks, and it's pretty intense time up there. But I never really went through like a lull, where I felt like I was dragging my heels. And I suppose I might have not wanted to get up early at sometimes, but aside from that, I love being up there. So I certainly do miss it, and I miss being able to look out and see the world, the way it really is, whenever I want to, and see it fly over. I still know, most of the people who are up there, each time a new mission goes up. Chris Cassidy just launched to the space station. He and I work together a lot as supporting other crews. So it's great to see him up there, getting a chance to spend time up there. But yeah, I missed the whole experience for sure.
I was kind of curious about this. So I'm starting my NASA internship, and I've kind of experienced that there's a very strong public image for folks who work at NASA, and it's kind of interesting having to maintain that public image. And I was curious. I know astronauts have to have, you know, a very positive, forward-facing uh, uh, public identity, especially even like the Mercury 7 people. Do you find that it's kind of difficult that you're in the public eye more than most people, or that you kind of feel the need to be a star, you know, person?
So it's not something I think about very much. I mean, I feel like I have a responsibility to share my experience with people because, you know, this whole program is something that all of us have paid for, and it belongs to the public. And so, you know, I'm so fortunate to have had the experience to, you know, to done it. You know, what something that comes along with that is sharing it, you know, with everybody that you can, and you know, and hopefully inspiring some people to do great things in their lives, you know, because of, you know, maybe something I might be able to say that would inspire them. So I look at it more like that. Yeah, I don't really, I don't really think about trying to maintain a particular image. I mean, I try to do it myself, and you know, I suppose there's certain things I wouldn't say because you know, I know that might be quoted, but you know, that's probably the hardest part is that, you know, even when you try to say, you know, even when you say things that you want to say, sometimes it'll be reported totally differently. I'll give you a funny example. One time I was talking to a bunch of Boy Scouts, and somebody asked me a question about the Japanese, you know, module or whatever, and I said that how proud the Japanese were of their part of the space station because, you know, now there is a spacefaring culture, and you know, that they see that as their foothold in space. And I saw it reported as that I said the Japanese are a space-fearing culture.
People really listen to your words, even if they don't even fully interpret them. In the Houston area, and I went to go buy like something off of Craigslist, and I was talking to the person what I did, and immediately they gave me a big discount for saying that I was doing stuff with NASA. I was curious if you've ever had any weird perks for saying that you're an astronaut.
I'm really careful about doing that and avoiding that. Sometimes it's hard to stop your family members from embarrassing you, though, and doing it. You know, I have some family that seems like whenever I'm out with them, they can't help but tell everybody and make it very embarrassing for me. But yeah, no, generally try to avoid that. However, you know, just, you know, by nature of the role, you know, even officially, there's been a lot of, you know, I guess you could call it perks, but, you know, so for example, after after a mission, most missions have been able to visit the White House. You know, most crews have been able to visit the White House after their mission to just a formality, you know, to say, be congratulated by the president. And so that, you know, that's a pretty neat experience. And so, you know, and then there's a lot after every mission, there's a lot of traveling around to do events, you know, to talk about the mission. And this is, you know, supported by NASA. I mean, you know, and especially if there's an international crew, you know, they want the whole crew to go to their country and travel around and do talks at, you know, universities or other public events. And so we do a lot of that, you know, after missions. And, you know, that's a lot of work. It's more time away from your family, but, you know, those are pretty neat experiences too. So I think there is a certain element of that.
I always really enjoy hearing about the research that's going on the ISS. I think sometimes people forget about that component, that, you know, that's really what the ISS is for. I was curious what experiments you specifically performed, and if there were any ones that you personally were invested in.
Yeah, actually. So I think the list for me during my mission was 70 experiments, and I couldn't even begin to list them off all to you now. But when I went up, the Japanese module was brand new, and we brought it up and installed it during the mission, and so the whole beginning of their science program was something that I did on my own. With two Russians on board, they were almost always on the Russian side of the space station. Everything that was United States, European or Japanese, Canadian, that was all my responsibility. And very few tasks in any of those modules would be assigned to Russian crew. And so the whole Japanese module, setting up all the experiments, beginning all their studies, testing all their experimental facilities and getting them working. That's a lot of what I did. And the European module was relatively new also. And the science program for Columbus, the European module, had just started about 4 months before I got there. And so those experiments were up and running, and I was, carrying those on, and plus all the everything in the U.S. So I got to do a lot of science during my mission. However, a lot of it is affected by the time for the science at that time. We were still building the space station. The time for science, always took a back seat to maintenance, repair, installation, the things that were involved with, getting the space station built. So sometimes it was hard to get enough time on the science, and so we often gave our weekends, whatever off time we had on the weekends, rather than staring out the window, we spent our time doing science on weekends, and get a lot more done that way. One of my favorites though was called Spheres, and I like that one because this was an MIT NASA experiment. It's free-flying robots that can move themselves around, and the experiments all had to do with things like formation flying and rendezvous and docking and different types of maneuvers with something that's flying in 6 dimensions. And I worked with MIT on some algorithms that were mine, and so I became a PI on that experiment. And it was the first time there was a PI, of the experiment on board the space station, during the space station program, principal investigator. So I got to work directly with MIT and run some of those experiments. I actually did some coding on board, which was really unusual, and that had to be my favorite.
That's super interesting. I kind of know a little bit about the spheres stuff. That was like they used compressed gases, right, to kind of maneuver.
Right.
And yeah, that was really interesting. I had no idea that you were doing some programming on board. That is such a weird and unique situation.
Yeah, well, if for anyone who knows what MATLAB is, we never had it on board the space station because you don't want people on board programming things that no one on the ground has a chance to review and test before actually operating it on the space station. But I managed to get MATLAB on board, and with this, it was interesting because we were able to convince the safety community that, hey, if these things fly outside this box, they're not going to turn off and they won't hit anything. And that allowed us to actually write code and run it on board without going through, months of testing on the ground. So, yeah, that was pretty neat.
So you also said that you like scuba diving.
I think there's a certain amount of diving that you have to do as part of the training, but I had been doing it for a very long time. I took my first course when I was at university, and it turned out my wife's family were divers, and so I had done a ton of diving. And when I was at MIT, I did a dive master course, and so I came in as a dive master, and that helped a lot. I think there are certain things like flying and diving that are just part of astronaut training, and if you already have them under your belt, it just makes things a bit easier. And we spent a lot of time underwater, right? All the EVA training is underwater in the neutral buoyancy lab. It's a giant swimming pool with the space station and space shuttle, not anymore, but had a space shuttle, under the water there, and you could practice the entire, EVA spacewalk on the modules underwater. But we spent a lot of time doing, fully the practice runs in the NBL. It was a big part of the training. And as you mentioned, we have the underwater training there's a habitat called Aquarius off the coast of Florida, mounted on the bottom of the sea floor, and we do training there. And that's different. It's kind of considered a space mission analog. You're living in a facility which, with life support systems that you're dependent on. You have to follow very specific operational procedures for everything, take care of the equipment that's keeping you alive. And then we operate the whole thing just like a space station mission. So we follow procedures and talk to mission control. Actually, it's real, the real mission control folks are at the other end of, the radio. So it's a complete integrated simulation. And they give us tasks, and we respond to them and work with them from inside the habitat, and then we go outside and do basically simulated spacewalks outside around the habitat for a period of time. I think my trip was 9 days underwater. So that's a fantastic analog to space flight, and that's why we do it.
Is that something that's required of all astronauts?
Well, at the time that I did it, I was on the third crew ever that did it. So this NEMO is the name of the program. This NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations. So I was on NEMO 3, and it was specifically for space station analog training. So it wasn't required for shuttle flights. So those who are doing space station flights generally have been doing it. I don't know if everybody's done it, but a lot of crew have done it now.
I know a lot of people that either want to work at NASA as astronauts, or maybe just branch into that kind of fields. Do you have any recommendations for people that want to eventually become an astronaut, and what they can do now while they're still in undergrad?
Yeah, there's things you can do. There's certain things you can anticipate that are going to be important. One of them is language training. Learning another language, and over the last 10 or 15 years, Russian has been a really important language to learn. It's unclear, at this stage, whether that'll be as important, going forward. But it's a good bet that it will be. I hope we continue to work with them, on our next phase of exploration. It's been a fantastic relationship, and and despite all the things that we're hearing about Russia all the time, it's amazing how closely knit we are with them, on the space station. We're literally joined at the hip. Can't function without them. They can't function without us, and it's something that I think has kept us engaged with them in a very positive way. I don't know that Chinese. I don't know that learning Chinese is going to be valuable or not in the future. It could be, and I don't know what other language. But anyway, language skills is definitely something important going forward with international cooperation in space. And then we talked about already things like diving and flying. Operational skills. I think that's the category. I think of it's not the diving, it's not the flying. Anybody could learn those things when they need to, if they need to. But if you're really interested in doing this, then NASA has to see you as someone who can understands an operational environment. So an operational environment is different than a textbook environment, different than ideas and working things out on paper or whatever. It's whether it's turning knobs or driving a car or scuba diving or operating some type of vehicle or system, the tractors or whatever. Someone who works on a farm is very operational. They know how to use tools, they know how to fix things. Operational skills are really important. It's really obvious to us when someone doesn't have those skills, when there's a certain amount of experience that just comes with fixing things, that you know how to, you're going to have to fix things in space. And someone with experience is probably not going to strip a bolt, when they try to remove it and or put it in. And someone with experience is going to realize what's going on and maybe how to offload the weight on something in order to, get Jimmy that situation to move a bolt properly. So this is really the key is, good grades are really important, and good recommendation letters are really important, and good teamwork skills, leadership, followership, all really important. And the extra thing that's different than probably most job applications is operational skills.
I know us at our at Suits have talked about this before, but I wanted to know your opinion on whether you think Pluto is a planet or not.
Yeah, that's funny. When the astronautical committee or whatever they're called decided that it wasn't a planet anymore, my son was, I think, like 5 years old or something, and he came back from school that day and he told us the scientists went up to Pluto and they told Pluto, "You're not a planet anymore." and so there you have it. Yeah, I don't, it's there. It's a solar system body, and it doesn't matter what you call it.
What's the best and worst food you've had on the ISS?
I might get in trouble if I start specifying the worst one.
Oh no.
The one I liked the best was called Fiesta Chicken. It was like a spicy fajita chicken dish, and it's a funny thing. When I was on orbit, I was often asked, "What do you miss from Earth? What do you miss in terms of food? And I miss pizza, and I miss ice cream, and I miss Diet Coke, and now I miss this phase. Now I miss some of the foods I could eat when I was up there. I can't get them anymore. But that was my best favorite one, Fiesta Chicken. I think my worst one, I don't know. There's a lot of them that, Russian fish. Okay, the Russians have a lot of fish. So Russian sardines, that would be my worst.
Is there anything you want to say to end this podcast?
I don't know. I suppose just that, thank you for your interest, and I hope that, you have a following of folks who will, enjoy this and help us, take NASA to the next steps. I mean, I'm very excited about the Artemis mission, and, we're doing a lot of work to support that. But getting, I always thought that, the moon and Mars would be, in my possible career span if I ever made it into the astronaut program. And now it's up to you guys to go. So, I hope that some of your readers get to be, future travelers and get to go to the moon and Mars. And I guess I'll be watching. But I'm very excited about the plans going forward to get people back on the moon and begin exploration, with sustainable long-term habitation, on the moon and eventually on Mars. This is probably the most exciting thing I think in our lifetime, and a very hopeful thing for humanity. So let's hope that'll, especially now, and with coronavirus and everything, let's hope these programs that bring hope to everybody, get to move forward.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to do this.
Thank you so much for coming to talk with us. It's always so great to hear all these stories from you. It's really inspiring.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Chamitoff.